Link TV, connecting you to the world. Link TV is viewer supported. Watch more at linktv.org.
Well, I originally come from Pacifica Radio, which was founded 62 years ago in 1949 by a war resister named Lou Hill. When he came out of the detention camps, he said, there has to be a media outlet that is not run by corporations that profit from war, but run by journalists and artists. And that's how Pacifica was born. 1949, the first station, KPFA in Berkeley, California. 1959, KPFK in Los Angeles. 1960, our station in New York, WBAI 99.5. In Washington, D.C., we have a station, and in Houston, Texas. And Houston is interesting because this station, KPFT, went on the air 40 years ago in the spring of 1970. It's the only radio station in the country whose transmitter was blown up. It went on the air, was broadcasting for a few weeks, and then the Ku Klux Klan strapped dynamite to the base of the transmitter and blew it to smithereens. Now, the silver lining was that it's not as if Pacifica had money to pay for advertising, and it certainly blew it into the consciousness of the potential listening audience of the people of Houston. And when they got back on their feet and rebuilt their transmitter, the Klan blew it up again. Why? Because I think they understood how dangerous independent media is. Dangerous because it allows people to speak for themselves. And when you hear someone speaking from their own experience, whether it's a Palestinian child or an Israeli grandmother, whether it's an aunt from Iraq or an uncle from Afghanistan, it challenges the stereotypes and the caricatures that fuel these hate groups. Whether you agree or not, and that is not the issue with what you're hearing, you find common ground. You say, it sounds like my bubba or my baby or my aunt or my uncle. And that is the power of independent media, providing a forum for people to speak for themselves. When I can't remember his title, it was Exalted Cyclops or Grand Dragon. I often confuse their titles. When he was tried, he said it was his proudest act. And I think that just shows how important independent media is. And so we move from there 62 years ago to today. We need independent media more than ever. The last book that I wrote is really a series of columns. I write for King Features, which is Hearst, and goes out to newspapers around the country and websites. I write with Dennis Moynihan, he's my editor, and the book is called Breaking the Sound Barrier, because that's what media should do, break the sound barrier. You know, we live in a globalized world, and we come from the most powerful country on earth, yet we are so insulated when it comes to getting information. The first column in the book takes place not far from here at the United Nations. It was 2003. It was right before the invasion of Iraq. And for decades, in front of the UN Security Council, a tapestry has hung. It's a tapestry reproduction of the Guernica. You know, Pablo Picasso's famous painting that he painted in a 21-day frenzy after the Spanish town of Guernica was bombed during the Franco years. It has become a famous anti-war symbol because etched in the faces of the animals and the people, you see the pain and the agony of war. He was so enraged with Franco, he said, the painting could never come home to Spain until Franco was gone. And he was afraid, since it would travel, that the painting would be destroyed. And so he had weavers make 3 tapestry reproductions of the Guernica. And one of them has hung in front of the UN Security Council. Now, this was the time when people like, well, then Secretary of State Colin Powell was giving his push for war at the United Nations, and other US administration officials were making their pro-war statements. And it wasn't lost on the UN and US officials, the irony of having this famous anti-war backdrop to these pro-war statements. And so they shrouded the tapestry with a blue curtain. I see it's our job to pull that curtain back, to show the realities of war. Could you imagine if for just 1 week, the front page above the fold, every surviving newspaper in the United States had photographs and a top story? TV and radio stations had their top news stories covering war. You know, showed babies dead on the ground, showed women with their legs blown off by cluster bombs or drone attacks, showed soldiers dead and dying. The homepage of every website, every tweet, people mention this. For 1 week, I really do think Americans are a compassionate people. And they would say, no, war is not the answer to conflict in the 21st century. And yet, even as the war intensifies in Afghanistan and continues in Iraq, make no mistake about it, even though President Obama talks about the drawing down of troops, we get less and less information about the realities on the ground. And yet, that is absolutely essential for us to make decisions, is to be informed. That's why the media is so important. I see the media as a huge kitchen table that stretches across the globe, that we all sit around and debate and discuss the most important issues of the day, war and peace, life and death. And anything less than that is a disservice to a democratic society, is a disservice to the servicemen and women of this country, who can't have these debates on military bases. They rely on us and civilian society to have these discussions that will lead to the decisions about whether they live or die, whether they are killed or will kill. That's how important it is. It's wonderful to be introduced by students and to be here at a school in Manhattan. Last night, I was introduced by another student. She's a senior now in college, but I met her when she was just graduating from high school. Her name was Leah Anthony Labrescu. And we invited Leah and Mari Oy onto our broadcast. Not names you would be familiar with. They were 2 high school seniors, and they had just come from the Rose Garden at the White House. They had just met President Bush. It was 2007, and they both, along with about 140 other students around the country, had been chosen as presidential scholars, right? I think something like 3 from every state are chosen. And so they went to Washington. It was in the last years of the Bush administration. And the next day, they were going to meet with the president. And Mari, who went to Wellesley High, and Leah, who comes from Long Island, went to Wheatley Academy. Mari thought, oh my God, I'm doing what people all over the world would give anything to do, meet with the most powerful person on earth. We better say something to him. And so she gathered with other high school students, other presidential scholars, and they wrote a letter to President Bush. They stayed up all night. And Leah was so nervous that the letter would be confiscated that she copied it over in longhand, just as Mari had written it. And she put it up her sleeve. Beware of smart students with something up their sleeve. So they went to the Rose Garden. The parents couldn't go. And these 140 kids gathered around, and the president came out. And the president said to them, the decisions you make today, the choices you make today, will determine the way the rest of your lives turn out. And so Mari said to President Bush, well, several of us have made a choice, and we would like you to have this. And she handed him the letter. You know, this was just adorable. This high school student is giving the president a letter, and so he smiled, and he took the letter, and he was folding it and putting it in his pocket. And then he said, would you like me to read it here? And she said, well, that would be your choice, too. And so he opened the letter, and he looked down, and he started reading the letter. This is part of what it said. As members of the Presidential Scholars Class of 2007, more than a third of the students had signed this, more than 50 of the students. As members of the Presidential Scholars Class of 2007, we've been told that we represent the best and brightest of our nation. Therefore, we believe we have a responsibility to voice our convictions. We do not want America to represent torture. We urge you to do all in your power to stop violations of the human rights of detainees, to cease illegal renditions, and to apply the Geneva Convention to all detainees, including those designated enemy combatants. President Bush looked up as he was reading, and he said, "We do not torture." And Mari responded to him. She said, "If you look specifically at what we said, we ask you to cease illegal renditions. Please remove your signing statement to the McCain anti-torture bill." You know what a signing statement is? Well, all presidents do it. It's just that President Bush did it more than all presidents combined. At that point, he had signed more than 1,100 of these signing statements. They sign a bill, in this case, the McCain anti-torture bill, and then the president quietly signs a signing statement beside it that says he doesn't exactly have to abide by this. And so she asked him to unsign the signing statement that he'd signed with the McCain anti-torture bill. He looked up and he said, "We do not torture." Mari Oy, when the meeting with the president finished, called her mom. She was very nervous, but she was very excited. And her mother was visiting the Holocaust Museum in Washington. She was just coming out of the last room. And she told her what they had done. Her mother didn't know that Mari was spearheading this letter that was handed to the president and that she had talked to him. And she started to cry. She didn't look much different than people walking out of the Holocaust Museum. But she started to cry because Mari had fulfilled her own dream. 40 years before, in 1968, Mari's mother, Willa Mishner, was also a presidential scholar, and she wanted to tell Lyndon Johnson to stop the war in Vietnam. But her favorite teacher told her, "You don't speak in the presence of the president." I know no teacher here at Calhoun School would say such a thing. But, well, because it was her favorite teacher, she abided by what the teacher said, and she regretted it for 40 years, and now her daughter had fulfilled her dream. Mari knew something about detention, not high school detention, but detention Guantanamo style, because, well, her grandparents had been interned in World War II in the Japanese-American detention camps, where more than 100,000 Japanese and Japanese Americans had been interned. The US government has since apologized, but Mari knew the history. Oh, and Leah Librescu, since Mari's letter wasn't confiscated, she actually did get to hand it to the president. The presidential scholars were all then supposed to be the backdrop for a No Child Left Behind news conference. And she thought, wow, I can use this opportunity too. And so she handed that letter she'd stuck up her sleeve to a journalist who was there. And that's how news got out all over. I asked Leah and Mari about their bravery. Leah said, "If I'm going to be in the room with the president, I've got to say something because silence betokens consent, and there's a lot going on I don't want to consent to." I said her name is Leah Anthony Librescu. Well, her parents named her Anthony, her middle name, for Susan B. Anthony. She certainly is going a long way to being a crusading activist, like Susan B. Anthony. Young people really are the hope, and I see it over and over again. I've written a couple of books with my brother David Goodman, who's a wonderful journalist. And our last book together is called Standing Up to the Madness, Ordinary Heroes in Extraordinary Times. In one chapter called Voices in Conflict, we write about Wilton High School in Connecticut, and a group of students who, well, were performing the annual play. No big deal. We all did it in high school. But in this time, during the war in Iraq, they decided they wanted to do something that mattered. And so they wrote a play together with their teacher, Bonnie Dickinson, their drama teacher, based on the letters and the statements of soldiers writing home or coming back home. They were putting the play together, they were making the sets, and they were learning their lines, and they were sewing their costumes, and the principal walked in. and said, you can do all of that, but you cannot perform this play on the Wilton High Stage. And they said, well, why not? And he said it was too controversial. And they said, but we've been doing this for months, and we've worked on it, and we've changed it, and we've incorporated all of these voices of soldiers. And he said, not here. They begged. He said, that ship has sailed. And that sailed them right onto the New York stage, because theaters in New York, like the Culture Project and the Public Theater, heard about the censorship, and they invited the kids to perform in New York, doing something actors dream of all their lives, to perform on the New York stage. And it was truly amazing to see. These kids were inspired. I did one of the talkbacks at the Culture Project after, where they all come on the stage afterwards and talk about their experience. And I asked a young man named Jimmy Presson, who performed the words of some of the soldiers, if he got to talk about war in high school. And he said, well, in history class and social studies, every week we are supposed to bring in a current events item, but we're told we can't talk about war. And I said, so there's nowhere? And he said, well, in our Middle Eastern Studies class, but they're not offering that this semester. And so the only place they could talk about the most important issue of the day, they're old enough to serve, but they weren't old enough to talk about it, was in drama class with this crusading teacher named Bonnie Dickinson. This got a lot of attention, and the New York Times wrote a piece about it. And in response, the late writer Ira Levin wrote a letter back to the New York Times. Ira Levin wrote The Stepford Wives, and he wrote, I lived in Wilton, Connecticut in the 1960s. In fact, it was the inspiration for Stepford, the fictional town I later wrote about in The Stepford Wives. And he congratulated the students for not being Stepfordized. It's that kind of conviction, of standing up, of people all over this country who, when they sense something is wrong, stand up, that makes such an enormous difference, that makes this country great. And we have to be very careful that dissent is not squelched, but actually encouraged. If you watched Democracy Now! Today, before we interviewed Ingrid Betancourt, we interviewed some activists from Chicago and Minneapolis, because last Friday, the FBI raided the homes of a number of people involved in the anti-war movement in the Twin Cities and Chicago. It's very frightening. We also had on the former FBI special agent, Coleen Rowley. You may remember her. In 2002, Time named her Person of the Year because she blew the whistle on the FBI and what it was doing after 9/11. And she spoke too, deeply concerned. All over this country, and a Justice Department IG report has just come out in the last few days, Inspector General report, looking at the level of surveillance and infiltration of anti-war groups in this country. The Thomas Merton Center in Pittsburgh, the Catholic Worker, a group of peace activists in Iowa City, in Iowa, saying that this is a very serious problem. And now this weekend, we see this, well, these kinds of actions, which cause grave concern for everyone, because it makes others afraid to speak out, to take a stand. This is a story I know well, the kind of crackdown in the Twin Cities, because, well, 2 years ago, in 2008, Democracy Now! Went to cover the Republican convention in St. Paul. Right before that, of course, we were in Denver for the Democratic convention. And my colleagues and I were arrested covering the convention. More than 40 journalists were arrested. And we're seeing this increasingly all over this country. Of course, the people who face the most frightening situations, the greatest repression, are reporters in war, especially Arab media workers in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. I think about so many reporters. Mazen Dana, a great cameraman for Reuters television, had been reporting for decades and was outside of Abu Ghraib. And he actually, together with the journalist he was with, approached the soldiers, and they could see what he was doing, and then they started filming right around the time of the Abu Ghraib story. And the US military attacked him, saying they had engaged a cameraman. Or I think of Tariq Ayoub. He was a young reporter for Al Jazeera. It was the day before Baghdad fell. It was April 8th, 2003, a few weeks into the invasion. Tariq had just come over from Jordan to begin reporting from the Baghdad bureau of Al Jazeera. And he went up on the roof to set the camera angle. You know, often it's too dangerous to film, but you set the camera angle and then you run back downstairs. But that morning, the US military started by strafing Abu Dhabi television, which was across the street from Al Jazeera. The broadcasters on Abu Dhabi television were screaming, "Someone please help us." And then they set their sights. I mean, Al Jazeera had given the coordinates of their studios, of their offices to the Pentagon. Maybe that was their first mistake. They had already been bombed in Afghanistan. And as Tariq set the camera angle and was trying to head downstairs, they strafed the roof, and he was killed. His wife, Dima Taboob, said at his funeral, "Hate breeds hate. The US says they're fighting terror. Who's involved in terrorism now?" And then, a few hours later, in Baghdad, the US military attacked the Palestine Hotel. You may remember this hotel. That was where the unembedded reporters were, hundreds of them from all over the world. And there were two cameramen who were reporting on different balconies. There was Taras Pratsyuk. He reported for Reuters. Reuters is, you know, an important international news agency, and sometimes we broadcast from there in Washington. And when you come out on, I think it's the 5th floor in the elevator, you know, corporate offices, but there's this one actually wooden stand like this, and there's a large book that's open, and every book is the story of one of their reporters, photographers, camera people who have died in war. And they put up a different tombstone every day at the base of this stand. It's that serious, it's that dangerous. So Taras ended up on the balcony. US military tank set their sights on the hotel, and they opened fire. They killed Taras, and they killed a Spanish cameraman named Jose Coso. Jose's family has not stopped to this day trying to hold the US soldiers accountable who killed Jose. He worked for Telecinco Television in Spain. The largest contingent of reporters who remained for the invasion were from Spain in the Palestine Hotel. Many others were injured. That was the day before the fall of Baghdad. Then came April 9th. And you'll remember this day, whether you think of it, you think you do or not, because, well, think of the most famous image of the invasion. The picture of the statue of Saddam Hussein going down. How many times did we see it? Thousands of times. See, that's why the images, the pictures matter. Thousands of times on CNN. Actually, the Wall Street Journal did an interesting piece comparing CNN domestic with CNN international. You know, they have the same pool of camera, of photographs, of video. CNN domestic showed the statue of Saddam Hussein with the rope just outside the picture were the US soldiers or the Marines bringing it down. But you saw this picture go up and down, almost imbuing Saddam Hussein with some kind of special power as it went up and down, up and down. Now, CNN International knew they couldn't get away with this because the other networks were showing the images of war, the casualties of war. And so CNN International showed a split screen. They showed the statue going up and down over and over again, but then they showed the casualties of war. I'm not comparing Al Jazeera with CNN. I'm comparing CNN with itself. That shows how deliberate the crafting of the image is. What we get for domestic consumption and what others got around the world. We need independent media. My brother and I have written another book called Static, and the reason we call it that is because in this high-tech digital age with high-definition television and digital radio, still all we ever get is static. That veil of distortion and lies and misrepresentations and half-truths that obscure reality. When what we need is the media to give us the dictionary definition of static: criticism, opposition, unwanted interference. We need a media that covers power, not covers for power. We need a media that is the fourth estate, not for the state. And we need a media that covers the movements that create static and make history. So back at the Republican convention in 2008, the first day was September 1st. It was Labor Day. And, we came out in the morning. Democracy Now! Is a daily, grassroots, global, unembedded, independent, international investigative news hour. And we were expanding our coverage to 2 hours for the convention. Every morning we were broadcasting from St. Paul Neighborhood Network, which is the public access station in the Twin Cities. In the morning, there was a major peace protest. It was led by soldiers, and that's a big untold story over these years, the level of resistance to the war within the military, from the low-level soldiers up to the generals, the thousands of soldiers who've refused to fight. The Pentagon doesn't like to talk about it, but it's based on their numbers. So the protest was led by soldiers, some in full military regalia, and that is taking a great risk when they do this. They can face serious consequences. Some had served in Iraq and Afghanistan, others had refused. And they marched, and then of course many civilians of every walk of life from all over. 10,000 people marching from St. Paul City Hall to the XL Convention Center. And we were covering the protest, talking to people, why were they out there? And then I went on to the convention center to interview delegates from the hottest state, from Alaska. And my colleagues went on to digitize tape at the studios. And then I got a call from our senior producer, Mike Burke. He said, come quickly to 7th and Jackson. Sharif and Nicole have been arrested, and I think they're hurt. Sharif Abdel-Quddus is our senior producer, and Nicole Salazar is our multimedia producer. I thought they were just digitizing tape, but I took off from the convention floor with the videographer I was working with from Big Noise Films, Rick Rowley, who spent many years in Iraq and Afghanistan, and we raced down the street to get to this place, 7th and Jackson. When we got there, it was a big parking lot. It was surrounded by riot police, but they had contained the whole area. I was on the convention floor. I had all my credentials on that allow me to interview presidents and vice presidents and delegates and Congress members, and I ran up to them. And I said quickly, I've just come from the convention floor. I'd like to speak to your commanding officer. You can see I'm a fully credentialed reporter, and 2 of our producers are inside, are reporters. You've arrested them, and we need to have them released right now. They're credentialed like I am. It wasn't seconds before they ripped me through that police line, twisted my arms back, slapped handcuffs on, threw me up against the wall and onto the ground. They charged me with, among other things, interfering with a peace officer. If only there was a peace officer in the vicinity. So I was desperately looking for Nicole and Sharif. I couldn't see Nicole anywhere, but I saw Sharif across the parking lot. He was standing with his hands behind his back, he was handcuffed. And he had his credentials on. I demanded to be brought to him, and finally they did. We were standing there together, handcuffed. His arm was bleeding, our credentials on, demanding to be relieved, saying, we're journalists. We demand that you release us now. Whereupon the Secret Service came and ripped the credentials from around our necks. And then I was put in the police wagon, and there was Nicole. Her face was bleeding, her credentials were on, she was handcuffed, and she quickly told me what had happened. They had gone to the TV station to begin work for the next day, but they heard a commotion outside, so they raced downstairs with camera and microphone. They wouldn't have been doing their jobs if they hadn't done this. And they raced downstairs. Nicole didn't plan on filming her own violent arrest. But there were riot police, there were protesters, and she just started filming. She's in the parking lot, she's trapped by the parked cars, and the riot police are coming at her in formation, and they are screaming, on your face, on your face. She's shouting back, she's holding the camera, she's filming, and she's holding up her press credential, and she's saying, press, press. And they took her down on her face. You see the camera tumble, and then if you were wondering what it was they wanted to stop happening, they pulled the battery out of her camera. They have her down on her face, knee or boot in her back. They're pulling on her legs, so that's dragging her face on the ground, and she's bloodied. Sharif is a very cool guy. He's telling the police to calm down. They take him, they throw him up against the wall, they kick him twice in the chest, and they take him down, bloodying his arm. So Nicole and I are taken off in this police wagon. I am dropped off at the police garage where they had erected cages for the protesters. And Sharif and Nicole are taken to jail. They face felony riot charges. If it weren't for independent grassroots media, the video of our arrests went online on YouTube. It was the most watched YouTube video of the first 2 days of the convention. It went viral immediately. And the response was tremendous. I don't know if the St. Paul authorities in Minneapolis, up to the federal authorities, how many hundreds, if not thousands, of calls, tweets, emails, whatever they got. But they got the message. And in a number of hours, I was released, and then Sharif and Nicole were. To show the effect it had, Sharif was in a cell with the AP photographer, and Sharif was released before he was. So then I was brought to the convention center. You know, it was the first night of the convention. It was wrapped up for the night to be interviewed by networks. I was in the NBC skybox, and when the interview was done, an NBC reporter had been standing listening to what I described, and he came over to me and said, "I don't get it. How come I wasn't arrested?" And I said, "Oh, well, were you out covering the protests?" And he said, "No." I said, "Well, the thing is, I'm not being arrested in the skybox either," right? Like Woody Allen says, 90% of life is just showing up. You got to get out there. And that's not a minor point. We have a very serious job to do. Yes, we should be on the convention floor. We should be interviewing the delegates, see what the divisions are, see what the watchword or the buzzword of the day is. We should be trying to get into those corporate suites. I don't know how many doors I had slammed in my face as I was reaching for the hors d'oeuvres and saying, "Oh, and who has paid for this shrimp cocktail? You know, who's sponsoring the Republican Governors Association, or who's sponsoring the Democratic Senate Campaign Committee? Who's paying for this?" This is very important. It's basic tenet of good journalism. Follow the money. And from the suites to the streets, we got to go there too, where thousands of people were, both at the Democratic and Republican convention. These are the uninvited guests who also have something to say. Democracy is a messy thing, and it's our job to capture it all. And we shouldn't have to get a record when we put things on the record. Now, the next morning, well, St. Paul Police Chief John Harrington was holding a news conference, so I had to go cover it. The police officer who opened the door to the news conference was my processing officer in the police cages in the police garage. So I said to him, "You not only have to let me into this news conference, you have to let me out when it's done." So Chief Harrington was describing the success of their first day's operations and how proud they were. So I raised my hand, I described what happened to Sharif, Nicole, and me. And I said, "What have you instructed your police to do? And how do you expect us to operate in this atmosphere?" He said we could embed in the mobile field force, the police mobile field force. Embed. You know, like reporters embed in the front lines of troops in Iraq and Afghanistan. I think the embedding process has brought the media to an all-time low. Because what are you going to get? I'm not saying reporters aren't brave who do this, but you embed in the front lines of troops. You're eating with them, you're sleeping with them, your life is in their hands. How do you think you're going to cover the operation? And you're seeing the war from the trigger end. If you're going to do that, you need reporters embedded in Iraqi hospitals, in Afghan communities, in the peace movement around the world to understand the full effects of war. And it's not only a problem of embedding in the front lines of troops. There's a problem with embedding in the establishment in Washington. You hear those softball questions that are asked at the White House news conferences. I call it the access of evil, right? Trading truth for access. That's not our job. There's a reason why our profession, journalism, is the only one explicitly protected by the US Constitution. because we're supposed to be the check and balance on power. It's that serious. And this model for covering war, the embedding process, should not become the model of how we cover American cities. So it's not acceptable that he says if we don't want to get arrested, we should embed in the police force in St. Paul. Of course, the next day I went out and I saw Fox with their baseball caps right in the middle of the police. You know, that's one perspective. What does it feel like to be tear gassed? What does it feel like to be at the target end? That is our job too. And it's very serious. We have just recently sued the Twin Cities Police Department and Secret Service for what they've done, because it is critical that we be able to operate freely. It's not just a violation of freedom of the press. It's also a violation of your right to know. Because if reporters are chilled, if they're afraid to go out, I mean, think of a young reporter, they're covering the convention and the editor says, go to this delegation and that, and they're thinking, well, right before the convention starts this afternoon, there's this big protest. I'll run out, we'll call it color, we'll get the color, and I'll run back in. But if they think they're going to be arrested, they're just not going to do this. But democracy is a messy thing, and it's our job to capture it all. And then it has a chilling effect, and this goes on. I mean, after being arrested there, it's very serious. You go to borders, and the border guards ask if you've ever been arrested, for example. They don't say convicted, they say arrested. And this gets serious. It makes it very tough to do our job. In Thanksgiving, which was just after the convention, I was going to speak in Canada. I was invited to the Vancouver Public Library. We're having a fundraiser for the different community radio stations that were running Democracy Now! And so we were driving up from Seattle, went to the border crossing, and we're just going to head to the library, which was about an hour away from the border crossing. Didn't expect much trouble. Handed in our passports. I was with my editor, Dennis Moynihan, and another colleague, and it's pouring sort of like tonight. And we handed our passports. He looked, and he said, okay, you pull over, and you go into there's a big border crossing, like a warehouse. So we went into the warehouse, and the border guards were there. And they called me up to the counter, said, Amy, come here. And I went up and they said, we want to see your notes on what you're talking about tonight. And I said, what I'm talking about where? They said, at the Vancouver Public Library. And, they had asked those questions if I'd ever been arrested. And I said, well, actually, the thing is about this notes issue, I don't really speak from notes. They said, we want the notes now. Well, I was never going to get to the talk if I didn't comply, so I raced out to the car and I got a copy of the book. And I came in and I handed it to the border guard. He handed it to another one. I said, so see, the thing is, what I usually do is, this is a book of columns, and I usually read a few of the columns and I kind of riff off them. And so it's not really notes that I have, but I have, he said, what are you going to say? So I said, well, I am going to, I didn't really plan to give the speech at the border, and I invited them. I said, it's a public address. You could come to the Vancouver Public Library. I said, actually, though, I'm going to start with the last column about how healthcare reform needs an action hero. I said, imagine the scene. I'm giving this talk at the border. Imagine the scene, America, 2009, 18,000 people have died in a year, an average of almost 50 a day. Who's taking them out? What's killing them? To investigate, President Obama might be tempted to call on Jack Bauer, the fictional rogue intelligence agent from the hit TV series 24, who invariably employs torture and a host of other illegal tactics to help the president fight terrorism. But terrorism isn't the culprit here. It's lack of adequate health care. So maybe the president's solution isn't Jack Bauer, but rather the man who plays him. Do you know who plays Jack Bauer? Kiefer Sutherland, whose family has very deep connections to healthcare reform in Canada, I said to them. Sutherland is the grandson of the late Tommy Douglas. Tommy Douglas is perhaps, well, CBC voted him greatest Canadian. Tommy Douglas was this crusading Canadian who became the premier of Saskatchewan. And because he almost lost his leg as a youth, and a doctor offered to help him if he would let the other medical students see how he helped him, and he got free health care. When he became premier of Saskatchewan, he pushed for single-payer health care, for socialized medicine, what they called Medicare. This was about the time of the debates over Medicare and Medicaid in the United States in the 1960s. And his major opponent in bringing socialized medicine to Canada was the American Medical Association. Why the AMA? Well, I think they were afraid the contagion would spread south. And so they led a strike of doctors in Saskatchewan for like 3 weeks. But the AMA lost, and Medicare, as it was called, healthcare for all, was adopted in Saskatchewan. And it was so wildly popular that it was soon adopted through all of Canada. And Tommy Douglas is responsible for that. His grandson is Kiefer Sutherland. Interestingly, I'm telling this to the border guards. I said, geez, you know, Sarah Palin comes to Canada. She slams your system, and you don't arrest her. You don't detain her. I am here to talk about the good qualities of single-payer health care in Canada. They didn't smile. So I talked about the importance of Kiefer Sutherland speaking out. In fact, he did testify. He spoke at a big rally in Alberta. He said, private health care doesn't work. America's trying to change their system. It's too expensive to get comprehensive medical care in the United States. Why on earth are we going to follow their system here? He said, I consider it a humanitarian issue. This is an issue about what is right and wrong, what is decent and what is not. Maybe Jack Bauer can save the day. And they said, what else are you going to talk about tonight? I said, well, if I get to the talk, I would like to talk about the global economic meltdown. It's extremely serious. They said, what else are you talking about? I said, and I thought maybe this is what they were getting at. I said, I would be talking about the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. They said, what else are you talking about? I said, global warming. I would talk about global warming. What else are you talking about? I said, that really would pretty much do it. And they said, are you denying that you're going to be talking about the Olympics? I said, the Olympics? Now, anyone who knows me, it's not that I love sports, but I don't really like to watch it on television. And I was a little embarrassed to say I didn't know what Olympics he was talking about. This was November, right? The Olympics were coming a few months later. But we had just gone through, you know, Obama going to Copenhagen to try to get the Olympics in Chicago. So I said, do you mean when Obama went to Copenhagen? He said, you didn't get those Olympics, the border guards. I said, I know we didn't get those. I said, do you mean that Rio got the Olympics? He said, you know what I'm talking about. Are you denying that you have come here to talk about the Vancouver Olympics? I said, the Vancouver, I didn't even realize that. But I thought this would so offend his nationalist feelings about being so proud. I said, the Vancouver Olympics? And I think it was my shock that just fueled his rage. Meanwhile, they were writing down everything I was saying. One was taking notes, one was reading the book, another was writing in the computer everything I was saying. So they told me to sit down, and then they went through our car with a fine-tooth comb, going through the computers. When I went out to check on them, they were on our computers, going through our notes, violation of a reporter's sources, until finally, they came back in, they took me in a back room, they took pictures of me, they took pictures of my colleagues, they stapled documents into our passport. I said, I wasn't aware we need a visa to go into Canada. They said, no, these are control documents. And I opened them and they said we had to be out of Canada in 48 hours. I spoke very fast at the various talks I had in Canada. So we made it about an hour or two late, but thank goodness for Canadians, they just went out, had a beer, and came back, and the audience was even larger. And it got even larger because this became top story in Canada. You know, Canadian broadcasting, CBC, radio and television, that they had detained an American journalist questioning me about what my thoughts were on various issues and what I was going to be speaking about. And I realized then, I mean, I hadn't been tapped into really what was happening with the Olympics. After I was watching the top stories, which were the story of my detention, afterwards, they were telling the story of the Vancouver City Council that had passed legislation that if you even had an anti-Olympic sign in your house could be raided. Olympic athletes were not allowed to speak negatively about the corporations that were sponsoring the Olympics. And we learned a lot. I was not planning to talk about the Olympics, but of course we came home to New York and we did devote our whole next show to the Olympics. Never let it be said that the state determines what we do on Democracy Now!, but they certainly were a spur to that. But seriously, it's absolutely critical that journalists be able to operate freely, to be able to describe what's happening on the ground. I think it's really important to go back to 2008, to this historic election and what took place. I mean, that night that Barack Obama was elected president I think the entire world heaved a sigh of relief. A few weeks after, before he was inaugurated, I was invited on CNN when the Obamas were going to the White House to meet with the Bushes, and it would be their first time going into the White House after the elections. So I was in the CNN studios, not far from here, and it was in the afternoon. We were looking at the video, and there was chattering, you know, among the different commentators they had on. And then I see the Obamas walking into the White House, and they asked me something else. I said, but wait a second, we have to take pause. Barack Hussein Obama, Michelle LaVaughn Robinson Obama. You know, she is the descendant of slaves. Grandfather came from South Carolina. That means Malia and Sasha are the descendants of slaves. And they are going into the White House where they will live, the most famous house on earth built by slaves. We must take pause. This is truly an historic moment. Whatever your political persuasion, we have never seen anything like this in this country, and it would have profound repercussions. Whether President Obama can redeem the White House, though, is really not up to him. It's up to everyone here and in every other gathering and home all over this country. Because though he occupies the most powerful position on earth, it's not about one person. In fact, you could take it from him. In the lead up to the elections, before it was clear he was going to win, he was in a Montclair, New Jersey backyard holding yet another fundraiser. And a person, as he was just leaving, raised his hand and said to Senator Obama at the time, what do you think of the Middle East? What are you going to do? What would you do about the Middle East? And he told this story that is a famous story of A. Philip Randolph. You know, he's the greatest organizer of the 20th century. He organized the 1963 March on Washington when Martin Luther King gave the I Have a Dream speech. A. Philip Randolph was the organizer of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, the black conductors at the turn of the century in the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, who were so instrumental in this country, who rode the Pullman cars. Obama told the story of A. Philip Randolph being taken by Eleanor Roosevelt, his friend, to meet FDR, to talk to FDR, the president. And A. Philip Randolph described to FDR the condition of working people in this country, the condition of black people in this country. And FDR said to him, I don't disagree with anything you have said, but you will have to make me do it. And that's how Obama responded to the question about what he would do about the Middle East. Make me do it. That is the answer. It's about movements. It's not about one person. Many people are deeply disappointed that 2 years in, President Obama, who said he would close Guantanamo, it's not closed, who said that he would challenge the Obama administration around torture, has completely followed in the footsteps of the Obama administration, for example, when it comes to extraordinary rendition. That's White House for kidnapping. When you take a person, they're kidnapped off the streets of Milan, or you take a Canadian citizen named Maher Arar, who was a computer scientist, was with his family on a vacation, came through Kennedy only to go back home to Canada, and he was taken off the plane in Canada, in JFK. U.S. authorities here in New York took him off the plane. They held him here for about 10 days, and then secretly, without anyone knowing, sent him off to Syria, where he was tortured for almost a year, and then released, never charged, back to Canada, a broken man. Tortured, interrogated, questioned. It's a remarkable story. A judicial commission in Canada was convened to investigate how this could have happened, how a Canadian citizen would be taken by the US and sent to Syria to be tortured. And they ultimately exonerated him fully. And he was awarded more than $10 million, but still the US keeps him on a terror watch list and won't allow him to fly planes into the United States. He sued the US government. But on all of these issues, you do have to ask, where is the person who made the promises that he would change Bush-era policies? But as I looked at the White House that day, I thought about another house, a couple of hours from the White House, on the eastern shore of Maryland. You know, Frederick Douglass, the greatest abolitionist of all time, was born on the eastern shore of Maryland. And he was enslaved as a youth and a teenager. And when he was a teenager, he was brought to a man named Edwin Covey, who was known as a slave breaker. That's who the troublesome slaves were brought to. It might not surprise you to know that Frederick Douglass was a troublesome slave. And he took him and he beat Frederick Douglass on his property. His property was called Mount Misery. And there he beat and tortured Frederick Douglass, but Frederick Douglass fought back. Ultimately, he escaped. He came north, and he changed the world. I used to go to this coffee shop downtown Manhattan on Church Street, old brick building, and there is a gold plaque there that says, Frederick Douglass took refuge here when he came north, in this place that was a printing press of a man born a free man in Connecticut, black man named David Ruggles, who owned a printing press. And it's so interesting that Ruggles and Douglass both saw the media, because Frederick Douglass ran the North Star newspaper, as their form of liberation, because information is power. It's that important. That property today, Mount Misery in St. Michael's, Maryland, is owned by Donald Rumsfeld. Seriously. He bought it in 2003, his vacation home, to be near his close friend, Vice President Dick Cheney, who lives down the road. Now, when I heard this, I thought, this is impossible. You know, it was the time that he was Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, who signed off on the torture memos, and is it possible he owns Mount Misery? And I read about it, I researched it, and I started to talk about it, but you know, I'm a journalist, so I have to see it with my own eyes. So Dennis and I, editor of the book, we made our way down to St. Michael's, Maryland, and as we got there, I realized I have no idea where the Secretary of Defense lives, but I did see an organic coffee shop ahead of us, and I thought, oh, they'll tell the truth. So you can see the themes in my life, coffee and pursuit of truth. So I went into the coffee shop and they said, what would you like? I said, I'd like to know where Donald Rumsfeld lives. And they said, oh, the Secretary of Defense, you just go down the road, you'll hit Mount Pleasant Road, don't go down that road, and then you make a right and another right, and you go down the road, and it's Mount Misery Road, and he lives at the end of it. Oh my God. So we got in the car, we went down the road. We didn't go down Mount Pleasant Road. We made a right and then another right. It seems we couldn't go right enough. There we saw at the end of the road the black tinted windows of the SUV, the Secret Service, and we knew we'd arrived. So I got out of the car quickly, I got my little camera, and I started zooming in as they were zooming out. And I'm thinking, does Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld understand the significance of this property? But sure enough, right next to the driveway is a stake in the ground that says Mount Misery. So we headed off then to an old black church down the road. And it was right before Mass. It was a Sunday morning, and the older folks were having Sunday school in the sanctuary. And I went up to one of the women. I said, well, what do you make of this? I mean, this is such a historic place. You have Mount Misery that was owned by Edwin Covey, who is known as the slave breaker, and he tortures Frederick Douglass there. Frederick Douglass is born here. And now Donald Rumsfeld, also known for torture, buys Mount Misery, and it's his vacation home. And she said, I can't comment right now. We're in church. Well, from Mount Misery to Mount Hope, I was speaking after that in Geneva, New York, and a young woman came up to me at the end of the talk, a student, and she said, tomorrow morning, I'd like to take you to Mount Hope Cemetery. It's where Frederick Douglass is buried. And I was so interested. And I said, but I'm flying out to Denver at like 5 in the morning. So, and she said, I'll meet you there before. So it was the middle of a snowstorm, and I drove up to the cemetery, and she was there covered in snow, and we raced off to Frederick Douglass's tombstone, and we brushed the snow off the tombstone. It was amazing. And then she said, would you just come with me? I want to show you one other tombstone. I said, oh my God, I'm afraid I'll miss my flight. She said, oh please, it'll just take a second, which it didn't. And we ran, and we were sliding and sloshing through the cemetery. It's a big cemetery. And then we came to this little tombstone that said Susan B. Anthony, who's buried next to her sister. You know, Susan B. Anthony and Frederick Douglass were not just allies, they were friends. Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist, Susan B. Anthony, the great suffragist. But they also supported each other. Susan B. Anthony was an abolitionist, and Frederick Douglass was a great feminist. He addressed the Seneca Falls Convention. And when I was telling the story at another talk at Wesleyan, a woman came up and said, and then did you go to the statue near Susan B. Anthony's house? That's not of generals, but of Susan B. Anthony and Frederick Douglass having tea together. The abolition movement, the women's rights movement, these are the movements that have made this country great. So I raced off to the airport and missed my plane. So I call up Dennis, and I say very quickly, Dennis, I've got to get on this plane to Denver. He pulls up the blueprints of the Rochester airport, and he says, okay, are you in the Susan B. Anthony terminal or the Frederick Douglass? I said, oh, please. I said, I'm in the airport. Don't kid around. I'm in a lot of trouble here. And he said, no, really, where are you standing? I said, I'm looking around, and oh, my God. Right in the ground in the tile, it says Frederick Douglass in that terminal. And over here in this wing, there's a little plaque that says Susan B. Anthony. Every once in a while, you have to stop and smell the coffee. So I made it to my next, on the next plane, and I made it to Denver. But these movements, this is what we need to learn about. And this is why our education has to be different from what the media gives us. I mean, if you are getting your information only from the corporate media, you really have to rethink this. Think of what we get on television. You get this small circle of pundits who know so little about so much, explaining the world to us and getting it so wrong. Where are the experts in their own communities, talking about their own experiences? I think this is the power of democracy now. It's not about pontificating. It's about people describing their own experiences. And so I want to end with 2 stories. One is the story of Rosa Parks. And you might say, well, that's one story that everyone pretty much knows. But not really. The media got it wrong with Rosa Parks as well. A couple of years ago, when she died, Democracy Now! Raced down to Washington. She was the first African-American woman to lay in state in the Capitol Rotunda. And then her body was brought to a Washington church, and thousands of people turned out. It was right before the big funeral in Detroit. Thousands turned out. Oprah was inside, and Cicely Tyson were inside. We couldn't get inside, but it's often much more interesting to be outside. And thousands were outside. There were big loudspeakers, and we interviewed this one freshman in college, and I asked her, why are you here? And she said, well, I emailed my professors this morning. I said, I won't be in class today. I'm going to get an education. And you know the story. Rosa Parks, December 1st, 1955. She sits down on the bus in Montgomery, Alabama, and she refuses to get up when the bus driver says, get up for a white passenger. And in so doing, she launches the modern-day civil rights movement. 4 days later, December 5th, the Montgomery Improvement Association had their meeting to begin the bus boycott. Rosa had just gone to court that day. And they chose as their leader a young minister who had just come into town, Dr. Martin Luther King. And that launched Dr. Martin Luther King. Rosa Parks helped to launch Dr. King. Now, how did the media get it wrong? They pretty much tell that story. But when she died, they said Rosa Parks was a tired seamstress. She was no troublemaker. That's where they got it wrong. Rosa Parks was a world-class troublemaker. She knew exactly what she was doing. Sure, she was tired, and yes, she was a seamstress. But she knew exactly what she was doing when she sat down on that bus and refused to get up. You know, she was secretary of the local NAACP. She worked with E.D. Nixon. He was president. He came out of radical labor politics. He was an organizer with A. Philip Randolph of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. He knew exactly what they were doing and what he was doing, and they together have been challenging the racist segregation laws for years in the South. She had trained at the Highlander Center. Dr. King had been there as well. Black and white together working to change the system, to most effectively, strategically do it. In fact, there were other young women who had sat down on the bus and refused to get up for white passengers. In fact, Rosa herself had sat down on the bus and refused to get up before. But you never know when the magic moment will come, when somehow it all gels. But if you're involved in social change, you will help lay the foundation for when that moment comes. Now, Rosa Parks was an activist. And the media denigrates activists. But what can be more noble than dedicating your life to making the world a better place? And to show how brave Rosa Parks was, just go back a few months to the summer of 1955. Emmett Till, 14-year-old boy, African-American boy, in Chicago. His mother, Mamie Till, wants him out of the city for the summer. So she sends him to her family in Money, Mississippi to be with his aunt, uncle, and cousins. And he's dragged out of bed in the middle of the night by a white mob. And he's beaten, and he ends up in the Tallahatchie River. They said he wolf whistled at a white woman. When his body was dredged up and sent on a train back to Chicago, his mother, Mamie, did something incredibly courageous. She said she wanted his casket open for the wake and the funeral. She wanted the world to see the ravages of racism, the brutality of bigotry. And thousands walked by his casket and saw his distended, mutilated head. And then Jet Magazine and other black publications took photographs, and they were published. And they were seared into the history and consciousness of this country. Mamie Till Mobley had something very important to teach the press of today. Show the pictures, show the images. And I want to end with just this story. Back in World War II, the story of a brother and sister, they were students, named Hans and Sophie Scholl. They were part of the White Rose Collective. They and their professor and others decided what could they do in the face of the Nazi atrocity. Hans and Sophie weren't Jewish. They were Christian Germans. But they thought, how could they stop what was happening? They knew they couldn't, but at least if they could get out information, the Germans would never be able to say we didn't know. And so they and their professor published a series of pamphlets, 6 in all. And on one of those pamphlets, it said across the front, "We will not be silent." Well, the Gestapo, the Nazis, caught Hans and Sophie and their professor, and they were arrested, they were charged, they were convicted, and they were beheaded. But that philosophy, that motto, should be the Hippocratic oath of the media today. We will not be silent. Democracy Now!
This has been a program of the Calhoun School Performing Arts Series. For more information about the school and its events, visit calhoun.org.
You've been watching an original Link TV production. To learn more or share your thoughts about the program you just watched, go to linktv.org.
Link TV is the only U.S. network dedicated to global and national news, uncompromising documentaries, and diverse cultural programs. Programs which connect you to the world. To learn more, visit linktv.org.